My ex left me for my wealthy boss. 3 years later, I bought the company and became her husband's boss. 3 years ago, I was living what I thought was a perfect life with my girlfriend of 4 years. We had this cozy little apartment downtown, split the rent 50-50, and spent our weekends binge-watching shows and trying new restaurants we found on food apps. She worked as an assistant at this mid-sized marketing firm, and I was grinding away at a tech startup that barely paid enough to cover my half of everything. But we were happy, or at least I thought we were. The first red flag should have been when she started mentioning her boss more and more in casual conversation. It started innocently enough, complaining about his demanding schedule, laughing about his quirky habits, mentioning how impressed he was with her work. I didn't think much of it because, honestly, I was buried in my own work problems. The startup was hemorrhaging money, my paycheck was always late, and I was putting in 60-hour weeks just to keep my job. Then she started staying late at the office. Like really late? Coming home at 9, 10, sometimes 11 at night with takeout containers and stories about how the whole team had to work overtime on some big client presentation. She'd collapse on the couch next to me, exhausted but oddly energized, talking about strategy meetings and creative campaigns in a way that made my debugging sessions and server maintenance sound incredibly boring in comparison. I started noticing other changes too. She upgraded her wardrobe, claiming she needed to look more professional for client meetings. New shoes that cost more than our monthly grocery budget, designer handbags that she justified as investments in her career. When I gently questioned the expenses, she got defensive, reminding me that she was actually making decent money while I was stuck at a company that couldn't even guarantee my next paycheck. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening in March. I had planned this whole surprise dinner thing, picked up ingredients for her favorite pasta dish, got a bottle of wine, even cleaned the apartment and lit some candles. I was feeling optimistic because I just heard rumors that our startup might get acquired, which could mean actual job security for once. When she walked through the door at almost midnight, she barely glanced at the romantic setup before dropping her purse and announcing she needed to talk. She sat on the edge of our couch, still in her work clothes, and told me she was leaving. Not just the apartment, but leaving me. For him. Her boss. She said they'd been developing feelings for each other over the past few months, that he understood her ambitions in ways I never could, that he could offer her a life I'd never be able to provide. The words hit me like physical blows. For years together, and she was throwing it all away for someone with a corner office and a company credit card. The worst part was how calm she was about it. Like she'd rehearsed this conversation, maybe even discussed it with him. She explained that he was recently divorced, that he'd been nothing but professional until recently, that they both tried to fight their feelings but couldn't deny what was happening between them. She made it sound like some romantic movie plot instead of the complete destruction of everything we'd built together. I wanted to yell, to fight for us, to demand she reconsider. But looking at her face, seeing how her mind was already made up, how she was already mentally packing her bags and moving into whatever fantasy life he'd promised her, I realized there was nothing left to fight for. She moved out that weekend while I was staying at my friend's place because I couldn't bear to watch her pack up 4 years of our life together. Update 1. The months following the breakup were honestly the darkest period of my adult life. I threw myself into work partly to avoid thinking about her, but mostly because the startup was actually getting acquired and I needed to prove my value during the transition. Turns out heartbreak can be incredibly motivating when you channel it right. I was the first one in the office every morning and the last one to leave, taking on projects nobody else wanted, learning new skills, making myself indispensable. The acquisition went through 6 months after she left, and suddenly I went from barely scraping by to having actual financial stability for the first time in years. The new parent company recognized my contributions during the transition and offered me a position in their main office with a salary that was triple what I'd been making. I took it without hesitation, partly because it was an incredible opportunity, but mostly because I wanted to build something that would make her regret her choice. I threw myself into understanding not just the technical side of business, but the financial and strategic aspects too. I started reading everything I could get my hands on about mergers, acquisitions, market analysis, investment strategies. I took online courses in my spare time, attended networking events, gradually building relationships with people in finance and private equity. My colleagues probably thought I was crazy, working 12-hour days and then going home to study balance sheets and cash flow statements, but I had this burning need to prove something to myself and to her, even though she was completely out of my life. About a year after the breakup, I ran into one of her former coworkers at a coffee shop downtown. We'd met a few times at company parties when we were together, so we recognized each other immediately. After some awkward small talk, she mentioned that my ex had gotten married to her boss just 6 months after leaving me. 6 months. They'd had this elaborate wedding at some fancy venue outside the city, and she'd quit her job to focus on being his wife and helping him entertain his business clients. Hearing about the wedding should have crushed me, but instead it lit this fire inside me that I didn't even know existed. Here I was, rebuilding my entire life from scratch, learning new skills, pushing myself to grow in ways I never thought possible, while she'd simply traded one dependent relationship for another. The woman who'd left me because I couldn't provide the lifestyle she wanted had ended up in an even more traditional, limiting situation than what we'd had together. I started paying attention to the marketing industry, partly out of curiosity about what she was up to, but mostly because I was developing this crazy idea. Her husband's company wasn't huge, maybe 50 employees, but they had some decent clients and a reputation for creative campaigns. More importantly, they were the kind of mid-sized agency that often got acquired by larger firms looking to expand their service offerings. I began researching their financial situation, their client retention rates, their market position. Meanwhile, my own career was taking off in ways I never could have imagined. The parent company that had acquired my startup was part of a larger investment group, and I'd caught the attention of some senior partners with my combination of technical skills and business acumen. They started involving me in due diligence processes for potential acquisitions, teaching me how to evaluate companies, assess their worth, identify opportunities for improvement or consolidation. Update 2. 2 years after the breakup, I made a discovery that changed everything. I was reviewing potential acquisition targets for our investment group when I came across a familiar name in the financial documents. Her husband's marketing firm was struggling badly. They'd lost 2 major clients in the past year, their revenue was down 30%, and they were carrying significant debt from an office expansion they'd done right before the market downturn hit their industry. What made it even more interesting was that the company's financial problems seemed to coincide exactly with when he'd gotten married and started delegating more responsibilities while focusing on his personal life. The leadership team was frustrated, several key employees had left for competitors, and client satisfaction scores were dropping. It was like watching a slow-motion car crash, and I found myself in the unique position of having both the knowledge and the resources to potentially do something about it. I spent weeks analyzing every aspect of their business, understanding their client relationships, their operational inefficiencies, their market positioning. I talked to former employees who'd left the company, researched their competitors, even attended industry events where I knew they'd be presenting just to observe their current capabilities. The more I learned, the more convinced I became that this company could be turned around with the right leadership and investment. But my motivations weren't entirely professional. I'd be lying if I said the idea of becoming her husband's boss didn't appeal to me on a personal level. Not because I wanted revenge exactly, but because I wanted to prove something. To her, to him, but mostly to myself. I wanted to show that the person she'd considered not good enough, not ambitious enough, not successful enough could end up in a position of power over the life she'd chosen instead. The investment group was initially skeptical when I proposed acquiring the marketing firm. It wasn't our usual type of target, and the industry was going through a rough patch. But I'd proven myself valuable to them over the past couple of years, and I'd done my homework thoroughly. I presented a detailed turnaround plan, identified specific operational improvements that could be implemented immediately, and showed them how the acquisition could complement our existing portfolio companies. More importantly, I offered to put my own money into the deal and take operational control of the company post-acquisition. This wasn't just an investment opportunity for me, it was a chance to prove I could build something significant from the ground up. After several months of negotiations and due diligence, they agreed to move forward with the acquisition, with me as the primary operator and minority owner. The day we finalized the purchase, I felt this incredible mix of excitement and anxiety. I was about to walk into the office building where my ex-girlfriend used to work, where she'd met the man she'd left me for, and announced that I was now running the company. The irony wasn't lost on me that the woman who'd left me for financial security was about to see her husband's job security placed entirely in my hands. I scheduled a company-wide meeting for my first day, wanting to address all the employees at once and outline my vision for turning the company around. I arrived early, walking through the offices I'd only heard about in stories, seeing the conference rooms where she'd spent those late nights that had ultimately ended our relationship. The whole place had an air of faded success, nice furniture and equipment that was a few years old, awards on the walls from better times. When her husband walked into the conference room that morning and saw me standing at the head of the table, the expression on his face was worth every sleepless night I'd spent learning about business acquisitions. He clearly recognized me from company events we'd both attended back when I was dating his now wife, but he was struggling to process why I was there in a position of authority. I could see him trying to make sense of the situation, wondering if this was some kind of coincidence or if there was something more deliberate happening. I kept my introduction professional and focused on the business challenges we needed to address together. I outlined the company's financial situation honestly but constructively, explained my background and why the investment group had chosen me to lead the turnaround, and presented a preliminary plan for getting the company back on stable footing. I made it clear that I wasn't there to blame anyone for past decisions, but that significant changes would be necessary if we wanted to succeed. After the meeting, he approached me privately, clearly uncomfortable but trying to maintain his professionalism. He asked directly if my being there had anything to do with his wife, and I gave him an honest answer. Yes, I knew who he was and what had happened between us 3 years ago, but my interest in acquiring the company was purely business-driven. I explained that I'd identified the company as a turnaround opportunity based on its fundamentals, not its personal connections to my past. What I didn't tell him was how satisfying it felt to be in that position, to have him asking me questions instead of the other way around, to be the one with the power to make decisions about his professional future. I kept those feelings to myself, but they were definitely there, fueling my determination to make this acquisition successful. Update 3. The first few months of running the company were incredibly challenging, but also deeply rewarding in ways I hadn't expected. I discovered that I actually enjoyed the process of rebuilding something that was broken, of identifying problems and implementing solutions, of working with teams to achieve goals that had seemed impossible. The technical skills I developed in my previous jobs translated surprisingly well to analyzing operational inefficiencies and process improvements. Her husband, to his credit, was professional about the situation and genuinely committed to helping turn the company around. Whatever personal discomfort he felt about working for me, he kept it separate from his job performance. He knew the clients better than anyone else, understood the creative processes that had made the company successful in the past, and was willing to put in the work necessary to rebuild those relationships. We started by addressing the most immediate financial pressures, renegotiating contracts with vendors, streamlining operations, and focusing our efforts on retaining our remaining major clients. I brought in some efficiency tools and project management systems that I'd learned about in my previous roles, which helped the creative teams deliver work more consistently and profitably. Within 6 months, we'd stopped the bleeding and were starting to see small but consistent improvements in both revenue and client satisfaction. But the real breakthrough came when I realized that my technical background actually gave the company a competitive advantage in digital marketing that we hadn't been fully exploiting. I started pitching clients on integrated campaigns that combined traditional creative work with advanced data analysis and automation tools. This wasn't just about pretty advertisements, it was about campaigns that could be measured, optimized, and scaled in real-time based on performance data. The first major client we won with this approach was a tech startup that needed help launching a consumer product. I was able to speak their language in ways that traditional marketing agencies couldn't, understanding not just what they wanted to communicate but how their technology actually worked and who their real competitors were. The campaign we developed for them exceeded their expectations so dramatically that they referred us to 3 other companies in their network. Word started spreading in the industry about our unique approach, and we began attracting clients who specifically wanted agencies that could bridge the gap between creative strategy and technical execution. Revenues started climbing steadily, and for the first time since I'd acquired the company, I felt confident that we were building something sustainable rather than just fixing something broken. About 8 months after the acquisition, something unexpected happened. I was working late in my office, reviewing proposals for a potential new client, when I heard someone knock on my door. It was her. My ex. She was standing in the doorway looking exactly like I remembered, but somehow different too, more polished maybe, or perhaps just more uncertain than she'd ever seemed when we were together. She explained that her husband had mentioned I was now running the company and she'd been curious about how I was doing. She said she'd heard through mutual acquaintances that I'd done well for myself since we'd broken up, but she hadn't realized just how well until recently. There was something in her voice, maybe regret or perhaps just surprise, that suggested she'd been thinking about our past more than I would have expected. We talked for almost an hour that night, catching up on the basics of our lives since we'd separated. She told me about her marriage, about the adjustment to being financially dependent again after having her own career, about missing the creative challenges of working in marketing. I told her about my journey from struggling startup employee to company owner, about discovering abilities and interests I'd never known I had, about finding fulfillment in building something meaningful. What struck me most about that conversation was how different we both seemed from who we'd been 3 years earlier. She seemed less certain about her choices, while I felt more confident in mine than I ever had before. The woman who'd left me because she wanted financial security was now dependent on someone else's success, while I built my own independence from the ground up. Final update. Over the following months, she started visiting the office more frequently. At first, she claimed it was just to bring her husband lunch or pick him up for dinner, but gradually it became clear that she missed being part of a professional environment. She'd linger in the hallways, chatting with former colleagues, asking about current projects, offering suggestions on campaigns they were developing. I could see that she was struggling with the isolation of her current life. The social events that came with being married to a business owner were mostly networking opportunities for him, where she was expected to be charming and supportive but not necessarily contributory. She'd gone from being an integral part of creative projects to being decorative at business dinners, and the transition clearly wasn't sitting well with her. One afternoon, she approached me with a proposal that caught me completely off guard. She wanted to come back to work, not necessarily in her old position, but in some capacity that would let her contribute to the company's success. She acknowledged that the situation would be complicated given our history and her marriage to one of my employees, but she felt like she had valuable skills that were going to waste in her current situation. I spent weeks thinking about her proposal, weighing the potential benefits against the obvious complications. On one hand, she did have genuine talent and experience that could help the company continue growing. On the other hand, bringing her back into the professional environment where our relationship had originally ended seemed like it could create all kinds of personal and workplace drama. But what ultimately convinced me to offer her a position was recognizing how much I'd changed since our breakup. The person she'd left 3 years ago had been insecure about his career prospects, financially unstable, and uncertain about his future. The person I'd become was confident in his abilities, financially independent, and clear about his goals. I wasn't the same man she'd walked away from, and her opinion of my capabilities or potential no longer had the power to affect my self-worth. I offered her a role as a senior strategist, working on accounts that would benefit from her creative background but reporting to me rather than her husband. It was a good position with fair compensation, but it also established clear boundaries about the professional hierarchy. She would be a valuable employee, but I would be her boss, and that dynamic would need to remain clear and consistent. Her first day back at the office was surreal in ways I hadn't anticipated. Here was the woman who'd broken my heart by leaving me for my former boss, now working as my employee in the company I'd acquired specifically because it represented everything she'd chosen over me. The irony was so complete it almost felt fictional, like something that would happen in a movie rather than real life. But what surprised me most was how little satisfaction I felt from the role reversal. I'd expected to feel vindicated, triumphant, maybe even a little smug about how dramatically our positions had shifted. Instead, I mostly felt sad about how much time and energy we'd both wasted getting to this point. She could have been building her own career and independence during the 3 years she'd spent being someone's wife. I could have been developing my business skills and confidence without the motivation of proving her wrong about my potential. The company continued thriving under our combined efforts. Her creative insights paired well with my strategic and technical approach, and we developed several innovative campaigns that attracted national attention and industry awards. Her husband adjusted to the new dynamic better than I'd expected, perhaps recognizing that his wife's happiness and professional fulfillment ultimately benefited their marriage more than her previous isolation had. About a year after she'd returned to work, we were reviewing quarterly results and celebrating another period of strong growth when she made an observation that stuck with me. She said that watching me build and run the company had shown her what real ambition and capability looked like versus the appearance of success that had initially attracted her to her husband. She realized that she'd been drawn to the symbols of achievement rather than the substance of it, choosing security over growth, comfort over challenge. She also admitted that leaving me had been the biggest mistake of her life, not because of what I'd gone on to accomplish, but because of what we'd had together before she'd gotten distracted by someone else's wealth and status. She said that working with me again had reminded her of why she'd fallen in love with me in the first place, and that seeing who I'd become had made her realize what she'd given up. But here's the thing that I think surprised both of us: I wasn't interested in going backward. The person I'd become through the process of losing her, rebuilding myself, and creating something meaningful from scratch was someone who understood his own worth independent of anyone else's recognition or validation. I didn't need her to come back to me to feel complete or successful. I already was both of those things on my own. We maintained our professional relationship and even developed a friendship of sorts, built on mutual respect and shared history rather than romantic attraction. She eventually started her own consulting practice, using the skills and confidence she'd rebuilt while working at my company. Her marriage survived the adjustment period, partly because her husband recognized that supporting her professional growth was better for their relationship than trying to keep her dependent and isolated. As for me, I kept growing the company, eventually expanding into additional markets and acquiring 2 smaller agencies to build a regional network. The financial success was rewarding, but what mattered more was the satisfaction of building something substantial and meaningful, of proving to myself that I was capable of much more than I'd originally believed. Looking back on the whole experience, I realized that her leaving me was probably the best thing that could have happened to both of us. It forced me to discover capabilities and ambitions I might never have developed if I'd stayed comfortable in our original relationship. It taught her the difference between being supported and being dependent, between choosing security and choosing growth. The story doesn't end with us getting back together or with me getting some kind of dramatic revenge. It ends with both of us becoming better versions of ourselves than we were when we started, and with me understanding that the best response to someone underestimating you isn't proving them wrong for their benefit but proving yourself right for your own.